El Shaddai. It's a name that even people who have not studied any Hebrew are often familiar with. In English, it's sometimes translated as God Almighty. There are other interpretations of the name that have existed through the years, including one rather fanciful, the God who is enough. These translations don't really do the name justice. The name occurs some 48 times throughout the Hebrew Bible, and we're going to look at all of them in this video. Oh my goodness, this is going to be a 5-hour video. I'm going to do my best not to get distracted and not to go on too many side quests. Hello, my name is Gilgamesh, and this is a channel where we talk about the Hebrew Bible and its impact on our culture and the meaning of its text. The distribution of the name Shaddai varies throughout the entire Bible. It's not at all even. About 60% of the appearances of the name occur in the book of Job. That's more than all the other books combined. The next runner-up is the book of Genesis that has 6 occurrences. Then all the rest of the books that have it have 1 or 2 mentions of the name. So it is clearly that it is lumped in certain areas of the Bible and not distributed evenly. One of the questions that comes up is, was the name Shaddai or the concept of Shaddai foreign? Did it come from some other culture? Most agree that it is clearly one of the oldest names of God. It's possible that Shaddai started out as a foreign god, and perhaps it was absorbed into Israelite culture. Perhaps an entire subgroup came in and were absorbed into the Israelite culture, bringing this, the name of their god, with them, that was then adopted and assimilated into the Israelite religion. That's one possibility. It's interesting that the character of Job himself is portrayed as a non-Israelite, as are his friends. We also have the non-Israelite Balaam, who uses the name. And if you don't know anything about Balaam, I've got a video about him here that you should watch next. So maybe this was some outside group that brought this into Israelite culture. Maybe it was outside foreign god that Israel adopted as a name for an attribute of their god. We could get a lot into the differences between polytheism and monotheism and how these things were done. Maybe I'll do a whole nother video on that. But the thing that is meaningful here is that these names were important to the people. They were not simply interchangeable. The names of God were of extreme significance, and they had nuance and meaning that was lost over time. By the time we get to the translation of the Septuagint, the meaning of the name has largely been lost, and they bring it into Greek and also into Latin with names that basically mean omnipotent. And this is not really what the name Shaddai meant. It was a later meaning that was placed upon it. If we try and go back and look at what the name actually meant, we need to look at 3 major possibilities. The first is the idea of destroyer. And this comes from a root, shaddad. And it was actually from this root that they got the idea of saying it meant almighty. Now, all-powerful and destroyer aren't quite the same nuance, but apparently they didn't like the idea of destroyer so much, so they went with he's just really powerful. And that's where almighty comes from. But the idea of Shaddai being the destroyer is one of the possible meanings of the name, coming from shaddad, which has a noun form of shod, which is destruction. We have this idea of the word shod making into the name Shaddai. There's also a different possibility, and that is the word shad, also occurring as shod, that means breast, particularly a mother's breast. And this is a symbol of fertility and nurturing. And so this is the other possibility for Shaddai, is that it had this idea of nurturing and fertility, and that was the actual attribute intended by this name. Now, as we have learned Akkadian, there is a third possibility which becomes quite popular among scholars, and that is that it might come from the Akkadian Shadu. Shadu means mountain. And yes, it's from the same root as the word that means breast. Breasts and mountains have been associated for a very long time. Let me tell you about the Grand Tetons. Guess what their name means? Yeah. So This is the same root, but in Akkadian, it had more the sense of mountain. We had believed that it might have carried that same sense in Hebrew, and that this might be God of the mountain. As we go through the different times that the name occurs, keep these possibilities in mind. I will mention a fourth possibility just for completeness here, and that is the word shed. Shed means a demon. And because it is a supernatural being, some people have tried to associate it as being related to the word Shaddai. It's not a very persuasive argument. I'm not really going to say more about it here in this video, but that is something to be aware of, is that there is a fourth possibility that you'll see floating out there. From the name Shaddai, in Hebrew, we often have proper names that are made from the names of deity. Well, we have three names, and as far as I could tell, only three names that contain the name Shaddai. And interestingly, they all appear together in Numbers chapter 1. We have in verse 5, we have Shaddayor, which means Shaddai is light. And in verse 6, we have Tsori Shaddai. Shaddai is my refuge. And then we have in verse 12, Ami Shaddai. Shaddai is my people, maybe people of Shaddai, something with people and Shaddai. So we have these three names all occurring together as ancestral names of chieftains of the tribes of Israel. Very interesting. Seems like it shouldn't be a coincidence to have that many occurring together. But let's jump into where it actually occurs in the text as Shaddai. So we're going to start with Genesis, and there are 6 occurrences in Genesis. First time the name occurs is in Genesis 17:1. And I'm going to read a little context to this, but it says, when Avram was 99 years old, the Lord appeared to Avram and said to him, I am El Shaddai. Walk before me and be blameless, that I may make my covenant between me and you, and may multiply you greatly. Then Avram fell on his face, and God said to him, behold, my covenant is with you, and you shall be a father of a multitude of nations. No longer shall your name be called Avram, but your name shall be called Avraham, for I will make you the father of a multitude of nations. I will make you exceedingly fruitful, and I will make you into nations, and kings shall come from you, and I will establish my covenant between me and you and your offspring after you throughout their generations for an everlasting covenant, to be God to you and to your offspring after you, and I will give to you and your offspring after you the land of your sojournings, all the land of Canaan, for an everlasting possession, and I will be their God. This is often recited as the Abrahamic covenant. It's very important and significant, and it is given from God, who announces himself as I am El Shaddai. Also at this time, circumcision was given, Isaac's birth is promised, and you may notice in the text there that Avram was given a new name of Avraham. That's important. Keep a pin in that, the idea of getting this new name there. We're going to see it again. Here we clearly have the association with offspring and fertility, as well as land rights and inheritance. The next occurrence is in Genesis 28:3. This is the second blessing of Jacob by Isaac. It says, El Shaddai bless you and make you fruitful and multiply you, that you may become a company of peoples. May he give the blessings of Abraham to you and to your offspring with you, that you may take possession of the land of your sojournings that God gave to Abraham. So again, the promise of land, but also being fruitful and multiplying and becoming many peoples. The idea of fertility and offspring is built into this blessing from El Shaddai. Moving on, Genesis 35:11. God appeared to Jacob again when he came from Padan Aram and blessed him. And God said to him, your name is Jacob. No longer shall your name be called Jacob, but Israel shall be your name. And he called his name Israel. And God said to him, I am El Shaddai, be fruitful and multiply, a nation and a company of nations shall come from you, and kings shall come from your own body. The land that I gave to Abraham and Isaac, I will give to you, and I will give the land to your offspring after you. A lot of similarities here, fruitful and multiply, many nations, and again, a name change. That's the second name change. All of this associated with Shaddai. Genesis chapter 43, verse 14, may El Shaddai grant you mercy before the man, and may he send back your other brother and Benjamin, And as for me, if I am bereaved of my children, I am bereaved. This is Jacob talking to his sons that were going to head back to Egypt to go see who they didn't know was Joseph. And they were trying to get permission to bring Benjamin with them. And so this is Jacob talking about that he wanted Shaddai to protect them, and he is concerned about being bereaved of his children. And so we have this idea of Shaddai being a protector, and particularly a protector of your children and offspring. Then as we move forward to Genesis chapter 48, verses 3, this is the blessing by Jacob to Joseph's children, Ephraim and Manasseh. Jacob introduces the blessing with, El Shaddai appeared to me at Luz in the land of Canaan and blessed me and said to me, behold, I will make you fruitful and multiply you, and I will make of you a company of peoples and give this land to your offspring after you for an everlasting possession. All the elements there again. This is preparing for a blessing to Joseph's children. He invokes El Shaddai, gives the idea of fruitful and multiply again, and the posterity forming a whole nation, as well as the idea of land inheritance. Then immediately after that, in Genesis chapter 49, we have the last occurrence in Genesis, and this one is a doozy because this really gives us a lot of information about the name. It says, from the God of your father, and one who helps you, and El Shaddai, and one who blesses you. Blessings of heaven above, blessings of the deep that lies below, blessings of breasts and womb, blessings of your father. They are mighty to blessings of timeless heights, to the bounties of everlasting hills. May they be upon the head of Joseph and on the brow set apart from his brothers. Lots of things there. El Shaddai here, and in the Hebrew it says Et Shaddai. Most people believe that it should be El Shaddai, but I try not to get sidetracked on that. El Shaddai here is parallel to God of your father. And so the idea of El Shaddai being an ancestral God is emphasized here. And he gives him the blessings of heaven above to the deeps below. That's idea of the grandness of the blessing. But then he gives him the blessings of breasts and womb. Breasts is Shaddaiim. That's the word that we believe is associated with Shaddai here. And obviously, breasts and womb, blessings of your father, these are fertility blessings that is being given to Joseph, that he will have lots of offspring. Really, I feel that this verse is the strongest one here to give away the game, that Shaddai is a fertility title, a fertility aspect of God, promising progeny and future generations. That's largely it for the Torah. The name only occurs in 2 other places in the Torah, and the next one is actually in Exodus, just to link the name to the Tetragrammaton. In Exodus chapter 6, verse 3, when Moses is at the burning bush, God spoke to Moses and said to him, I am the Lord. I appeared to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob as El Shaddai. By my name, Lord, I did not make myself known unto them. So this acknowledges the unity of the names, referring to them being the same God, and it opens up a lot of questions, as it clearly contradicts the other stories that show that the patriarchs did know the Tetragrammaton name. Could this be an indication that another culture was assimilated into Israelite culture? Quite possibly. But also, this is a name change. Again, this makes our third name change, where he is saying that he was known as El Shaddai, but he is now going to be known by the Tetragrammaton. The other place where it occurs in the Torah is in the book of Numbers. Of course, the book of Numbers is where we also have the proper names that include the name Shaddai. But in the book of Numbers, in chapter 24, verse 4, and also verse 16, we have the story of Balaam, and they have this rather formulaic thing of him saying, the oracle of him who hears the words of God, who sees the vision of Shaddai, falling down with his eyes uncovered. It's very formulaic. It makes clear that Balaam is prophesying by the power of Shaddai. Interestingly, the reference to Balaam outside the Bible that we have has the word Shaddaiim in it, which is the plural of Shaddai in Aramaic. I have a whole video on that. Go check it out. In verse 16, when this formula kind of repeats, it's slightly different. The oracle of him who hears the words of God and knows the knowledge of Elyon, who sees the vision of Shaddai falling down with his eyes uncovered. Here we have Shaddai put in parallel with Elyon, or the Most High. This is another name that has lots of questions around it, but here we have Shaddai and Elyon somewhat linked together here, and again, by Balaam, a non-Israelite, as the power of his prophecy there. So that's it for the Torah and the Torah's references to Shaddai. If we go further, one I want to talk about next is Ruth. Ruth has the term Shaddai used twice in chapter 1, verse 20, and also verse 21, and it's put in the mouth of Naomi, who says, and this is after, if you don't know the story, this is after her sons have died, and Ruth is left as a widow and Naomi as an older woman who won't likely have more sons. This is what Naomi says. She said unto them, do not call me Naomi, call me Mara, for Shaddai has dealt very bitterly with me. I went away full, and the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi when the Lord has testified against me, and Shaddai has brought calamity upon me? Here again, we have a clear equivalence of parallels here between the Tetragrammaton and the name Shaddai. We also have another name change. That's 4 name changes associated with Shaddai. That seems too much to be coincidence. And what is it that she is saying about Shaddai? She has lost her children. She went away full. She's coming back empty, meaning she's returning to Jerusalem after her sojourn in Moab. And she has lost her husband and her children. And she is directly attributing this to Shaddai having dealt bitterly with her. That's the only time Shaddai is mentioned in that entire story. Coming on this idea here, we have Isaiah. Isaiah is a master of words, and leave it to him to give a very interesting and witty portrayal of Shaddai. He uses the name only once in his entire book, but when he does, he seems to be doing a dual meaning on the name, playing off both the idea of destruction and the idea of fertility. Let's take a look at it. This is in chapter 13, verse 6 of Isaiah. It says, wail, for the day of the Lord draws near. Like shod from Shaddai, it will come. Therefore, all hands will be feeble, and every human heart will melt. They will be out of breath. Spasms and labor pains will seize them. Like giving birth, they shall have pains. A man will say to his neighbor, their faces will freeze with fear. Flames are their faces. Yes, he's saying that it will come like shod from Shaddai. Now, the word shod, as we've mentioned, can be a noun that means destruction. It also can be a noun that means breast. Which one does it mean here? He seems to be playing off of both of them. He's portraying that this will be a bad thing that happens to the people. But what is the bad thing that happens to these people? The bad thing is that the men will go through childbirth. They'll be out of breath. They'll have spasms or contractions and labor pains. They will be seized with the birth pangs. And one man will look to his neighbor. And yes, the Hebrew says one man will look to his neighbor, and their faces will freeze with fear. Their faces in flames because of the labor process. Yes, he uses the idea of labor and childbirth as the example of the kind of destruction that comes from Shaddai. Oddly marrying both the idea that this is the word for a destroyer, but also a fertility god in this very interesting, unique way that Isaiah can. And this is the only time that he uses the name. And this is how he chooses to portray it. Quite interesting. The other time that you're going to see it in the literary prophets is in the book of Yoel. And unfortunately, it doesn't shed a lot of light on this because it's just quoting Isaiah, which Yoel does in a few places, sometimes adding interesting twists and reversals on it. But in Yoel chapter 1, verse 15, it says, alas for the day of the Lord is near, like shod from Shaddai it comes. Just quotes Isaiah and doesn't elaborate on the whole story. And so this is an interesting riff. It's like Yoel expected his readers to already be familiar with the Isaiah quote, and he's using this simply as a shorthand to bring to mind the entire passage. He just simply mentions it and moves on, kind of like making a pop culture reference that we might expect our listeners to already know the deeper or more long-winded meanings of such things. That's precisely what Yoel is doing here. It also shows up in Ezekiel, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But first, I want to talk about Psalms. The name Shaddai shows up only twice in Psalms. The first time is in Psalm 68. Psalm 68 is different. It's a psalm that quotes multiple times from the Song of Devorah, which is found in Judges 5. But it also quotes from the Song of the Ark, which is in Numbers 10. And it seems to have all these interesting fragments of poetry that it's bringing into Psalm 68, but they don't fit together neatly. It's got some just great one-liners, but as a whole, it's hard to quite get a theme out of the entire psalm. And there's some parts to it where the Hebrew is particularly hard to decipher what it's saying. So it's a complicated mess. And we don't know, is it early, is it late? We're not really sure. But it definitely quotes from some very early texts, particularly Song of Devorah in Judges 5 is considered one of the earliest texts. It brings in a lot of references to things that could be related to Shaddai. And if you want to believe that Shaddai means God of the mountain, this is your reference. This is the strongest case for that. And so in Psalm 65, it says, Father of orphans and judge of widows, God in his holy abode. So we do have the idea of the fatherless and widows, which seems to be related with Shaddai and his whole protection, motherly, fertility role there. Then here's an interesting thing. The wings of the dove are inlaid with silver and her feathers with precious gold. The idea of bird's wings, interesting. Remember that. When Shaddai scattered the kings there, it snowed on Zalmon. We don't know what this is referring to. It's obviously something historical. When did Shaddai scatter kings? And where is Zalmon? We think Zalmon is somewhere up in the northern area, in the area of Bashan. We don't really know a good candidate for it. Some people think it might be Mount Gerizim, but it apparently snowed there, which is interesting. So there is some sort of a action of some kind, and Shaddai scattered the kings there. So when Shaddai scattered the kings there, it snowed on Zalmon. Mountain of God, mountain of Bashan, mountain of crooked ridges, mountain of Bashan. Why do you leap, O mountains, or crooked ridges? The mountain God desired for his dwelling. Yes, the Lord will abide there forever. We've got a lot of interesting things happening with that. It clearly is talking about being a god of a mountain. This is the only time that God is ever referred to as the God of the mountain of Bashan. That's not usual. Now, this same psalm does mention Sinai as well. And so there's a lot of mountain imagery in this psalm. And of course, Zalmon is some kind of a mountain where it snowed. So yeah, if you want Shaddai to be related to a mountain, this is your reference. It's a little strange, hard to make complete sense out of, but it also has association with wings and with widows and orphans. So got kind of a grab bag of everything with this one. So let's look at the other place where it shows up in the Psalms, and that's in Psalm 91, right in verse 1. It says, He who dwells in the shelter of Elyon, in the shadow of Shaddai, lies at night. I say of the Lord, my refuge and bastion, my God in whom I trust. For he will save you from the fowler's snare, from the disastrous plague. With his feather he shelters you, and beneath his wings you take refuge. Here we are again with wings, as a shelter and a refuge. And this, of course, often a motherly figure. Mother birds sheltering their young under their wings is a common imagery. And again, we have a parallel between Elyon and Shaddai. And in fact, this one sort of has a triple parallel between Elyon, Shaddai, and the Tetragrammaton. And this one is all about protection. So that's what we have in the Psalms, is those two references to Shaddai. Now let's take a look at Ezekiel, the last place where it shows up in the literary prophets. In Ezekiel, there are two places it shows up. One is Ezekiel 1, verse 24. And they went, I heard the sound of their wings, like the sound of many waters, like the sound of Shaddai, a sound of tumult, like the sound of an army. When they stood still, they let down their wings. Here in verse 24, he's associating the wings with Shaddai again. So this is our third reference of wings and Shaddai together, which is starting to seem like more than a coincidence. Now, Ezekiel would have been one of the later uses of this. It's one of the later books written. And so we're not sure if some of the meaning of Shaddai at this point had faded. We know that it will fade over the next century or so after Ezekiel. And so maybe he's using the name somewhat more generically, but he's associating it with the wings of the cherubim. He's using this name here to describe the sound of those wings. Kind of an interesting choice. Now, if we look at the second reference, it's actually quite similar. It's Ezekiel 10:5. It says, and the sound of the wings of the cherubim was heard as far as the outer court of the temple, like the voice of El Shaddai when he speaks. So very similar. Sound of the wings of the cherubim again. Both settings are in the temple, and it's associated with the sound of the voice of El Shaddai. Notice it is El Shaddai, this one. A lot of these have just been Shaddai. This is one of the few references of El Shaddai outside of the book of Genesis. And that's what Ezekiel has to say about it. Now, we're not even halfway done because there's the book of Job. And the book of Job uses the term Shaddai a whole lot. And it's used by Job, it's used by his various friends, and let's see what we can glean from it. We're going to go through this at a rapid clip here. There are 31 references in the book of Job, and the first one is in Job chapter 5, verse 17. Notice that the name Shaddai actually doesn't appear in the first few introductory chapters that are so famous, or the wind-up chapters at the end. It's all in the middle section of his friends going about in debate. And so in Job 5:17, his friend Eliphaz says, why happy the man whom God corrects? Shaddai's reproof do not spurn, for he causes pain and binds the wound. He deals blows, but his hands will heal. And you shall know that your tent is peaceful. Probe your home and find nothing amiss. And you shall know that your seed is abundant, your offspring like the grass of the earth. So lots of things there to unpack with that. Shaddai is both a person who causes pain and heals. So he's given both the destroyer and healer role here. And he associates it with your home being peaceful and having children, that your seed will be abundant, your offspring like the grass of the earth. In the next chapter, Job responds with this interesting phrase here in Job 6:4, for Shaddai's arrows are in me, their venom my spirit drinks. So we don't learn a lot about Shaddai here, other than Job feels he has punished him, and this reminds us of the statement of Naomi. He has lost his children. That is a major theme in the book of Job. And so he is saying, Shaddai's arrows are in me. He is feeling this destroyer aspect of Shaddai. Later in chapter 6, he references Shaddai again, verse 14. The blighted man's friend owes him kindness, but the fear of Shaddai he forsakes. So he is making a subtle cut at his friends here who should be kind to him, but they are not properly showing the fear of Shaddai as they talk to him. A little later, his friend Bildad asks an important question here about the justice of God. This is in Job chapter 8, verse 3. Would God pervert justice? Would Shaddai pervert that which is right? If your children offended him, he dispatched them because of their crime. If you yourself sought out El and pleaded to Shaddai, if you were honest and pure, by now he would rouse himself for you and would make your righteous home whole. Your kids must have done something wrong, and that's why Shaddai killed them, which is a bit of how things go with Job's friends. And if you would repent, your home would be restored. And so again, this idea of Shaddai being involved in the children and the stability of the home is a major theme. We skip a few more chapters here and find the name again, where his friend Zophar is basically talking about how you can't really understand God. This is Job 11, verse 7. Can you find what God has probed? Can you find Shaddai's last end? Higher than heaven, what can you do? Deeper than Sheol, what can you know? Longer than the earth is its measure, and broader than the sea. This reminds us a lot of the Genesis 49, where it is higher than the heights and deeper than the deeps. Very similar language that's being used here by Zophar. And so he's saying that God is unfathomable, and he is invoking Shaddai in this. Job, when he responds in chapter 13, verse 3, expresses his desire to speak to God. He says, "Yet I would speak to Shaddai, and I want to dispute with God." Doesn't tell us a whole lot about the situation, but it does give us a little bit of information. Next, we have Eliphaz, Job's friend, who in chapter 15, verse 25, gives us the sound of fear is in his ears. In peacetime, the destroyer overtakes him, for he reached out his hand against God, and Shaddai he assaulted. Ultimately, he will wilt, and his boughs will not be green. He will shed his unripe fruit like a vine, and cast off his bloom like an olive tree. So this is talking about that a wicked man, and he's subtly implying that might be Job, that a wicked man attacks Shaddai, and that as a result he will get destruction. And he couches it in very agricultural terms, that his boughs will not be green, and that his vine will not bring forth its fruit. The olive tree is going to lose its olives when they're still in the flower state. These are common metaphors for offspring, and so he may be referencing that. But it is clear here he is saying that if you were to assault Shaddai, try to attack Shaddai, the result would be these agricultural calamities. And so, again, possibly tied to the idea of fertility, a little bit less directly to offspring. It seems to be speaking of such things metaphorically, but it fits in the general line of things. The next thing we see is in Job chapter 21, both verses 15 and verses 20. Job is trying to struggle with the idea that wicked people seem to do fine. And he says here, "And they say to God, turn away from us. We have no desire to know your ways. Who is Shaddai that we should serve him? And what use for us to entreat him? Does God set aside for his sons his affliction? Let him pay back that he may know. Let his own eyes see his collapse. Let him drink from Shaddai's seething venom. For what will he care for his home when he's gone, and the number of his months broken off?" Who is Shaddai that we should serve him really mirrors the words of Pharaoh of who is the Lord that I should know him. It's an arrogant thing, and Job is saying that those who turn away from God turn away from Shaddai. And the response is that those that do so will drink from Shaddai's seething venom. And he mentions here that his will be destroyed and his life will be cut short. Moving on to Job chapter 22. This chapter has the most references to Shaddai in all of Job. And so there are 5 references to Shaddai. And this is Eliphaz speaking. And he's basically talking about that Shaddai doesn't benefit anything from us being righteous. He says, "Does Shaddai desire that you be in the right, or profit if your ways are blameless? Who say to God, turn away from us? And what can Shaddai do to them? And when he has filled their homes with bounty, the counsels of the wicked be far from me, the righteous shall see and rejoice, and the innocent shall mock them. Their substance is surely destroyed, and their remnant the fire consumes. Be accustomed to him, be at peace, and through his will your comings be blessed. Take prey from his mouth instruction, and set his utterances in your heart. If you come back to Shaddai, you're restored. If you banish evil from your tent, and lay your gold down in the dust, on a brook-bordered rock your Ophir treasure, and Shaddai will be your gold. heaped up silver for you, for then you'll take pleasure in Shaddai and will lift up your face to God, and you will entreat him, and he will hear you, and your vows you will pay. So this is Eliphaz entreating Job to repent and saying that returning to Shaddai will cause restoration. He talks about giving up gold and treasure here and making Shaddai your golden treasure, and that he will be able to fulfill his vows. And so this doesn't fit any of our themes terribly well, but not every verse is going to be spot on with any interpretation of this name. Now, Job responds in chapter 23, verse 16, so I am dismayed before him. I look, am afraid of him, and God has made my heart quail. Shaddai has dismayed me. In this verse, Job talks about how he is afraid of Shaddai, and that Shaddai inspires fear in him. We don't get a lot more to it than that. The next chapter, chapter 24, which is actually just a few verses below this, because that was the end of 23, it goes on in a little bit more detail. So 24 verse 1, why are dire times not stored by Shaddai, and those who know him behold not his days? They set aside boundary stones, a flock they steal and pasture it. The orphan's donkey they drive off. They take in pawn the widow's ox. They steal the orphan from the breast, and the poor man's suckling they take in pawn. So we have here the reference to breasts and taking orphans from the breast. They have the idea here of the wicked taking the advantage of the fatherless's livestock, their donkey, as well as the widow's ox. And so we have a lot of things here of social justice that are very common in the Hebrew Bible of taking care of these people, but we do have this idea that they are stealing the orphan from the breast. And if that is a link to Shaddai, then that makes a lot of sense. Then we come to chapter 27 of Job. Now, Job establishes a bit of a theme in this chapter. He talks about how Shaddai has vexed him, but that the wicked cannot expect to be able to call on Shaddai in their moment of need. And let's hear what he has to say here. This has 4 references to Shaddai in this chapter in verses 2, 10, 11, and 13. It says, by God who denied me justice, and Shaddai who embittered my life. Now, at this point, we think that Job swore by Shaddai, and we think that the speakers actually switched to Zophar, his friend, because what follows doesn't seem to meet with Job's statements, but seems to be that they should have switched speakers over to Zophar. So this might be his friend speaking in this next part. For what hope has the tainted to profit when God takes away his life? Will God hear his scream when disaster befalls him? Will he delight in Shaddai? Will he call upon God at all times? Let me teach you with God's own force. What is with Shaddai I will not conceal. Look, all of you have beheld it. And why do you spew empty breath? This is the wicked man's share with God, the portion that oppressors take from Shaddai. If his sons be many, it is for the sword. And if his offspring go without bread, his survivors will be buried in the death plague, and his widows will not keen. So at the end here, we have the idea that those that rebel against Shaddai will lose their children, and their widows will not mourn them. After this, Job responds in chapter 29, verse 5. And what does he say? Would that I were as in moons of yore, as the days when God watched over me. When he shone his lamp over my head, by its light I walked in darkness, as I was in the days of my prime. God, an intimate of my tent, when Shaddai was with me, and around me my children. Very moving verse about Job remembering happier days when God was part of his tent and he had his children with him. Then in 31, verse 2, Job says, and what is the share from God above, the portion from Shaddai in the heights? Doesn't tell us a lot. A little later in that same chapter, verse 35, would that I had someone to hear me out. Here's my mark. Let Shaddai answer me, and let my accuser indict his writ. We'd really like Shaddai to confront him with what he's done wrong. We'd like to face him in some sort of a legal judicial setting, which is a bit of a theme in the book of Job. Then we get this break-in by the young whippersnapper Elihu. And we think this whole part by Elihu might be a later addition to the text. We're not sure. It doesn't fit with the rest of the book of Job. He might even be comic relief. The next several references are from Elihu to Shaddai. In Job 32:8, he says, yet it is a spirit in man and Shaddai's breath that grants discernment. So he says that Shaddai is the source of his wisdom. A little later, Job 33:4, God's spirit has made me and Shaddai's breath has quickened me. Now he seems to be associating Shaddai with creation, which, new take. And then in chapter 34, he uses the name twice in verses 10 and 12. For he has said, what use to a man to find favor with God? Therefore, discerning men, hear me. Far be from God any wickedness, from Shaddai any wrong. For a man's acts he pays him back, and by a person's path he provides him. Surely God does not act wickedly, and Shaddai does not pervert justice. Talks about the justice of Shaddai and that he punishes the wicked, but doesn't give us a whole lot more to the name than that. Then the next recurrence is in chapter 35, verse 13. But to falseness God will not listen, and Shaddai will not behold it. Doesn't tell us much again. Elihu then in Job 37:23 actually takes a bit of a different take. He seems to cast Shaddai as a weather or storm god. In chapter 37, it says, God thunders wondrously with his voice, doing great things that we cannot know. For to the snow he says, be on earth, and rain in torrents, the rain of his mighty torrents. And now they have not seen the light, bright though it be in the skies, as a wind passes, making them clear. From the north gold comes, over God, awesome, Shaddai, whom we find not is lofty in power, in judgment and great justice. He will not oppress. So seems to me he's almost casting Shaddai as though he were a storm god coming in like a rolling storm. That's the only place where that kind of association seems to happen with the name. And again, we're not really sure what's up with Elihu in the book of Job. It's possibly an intrusion from another text. The final use of the word Shaddai in the book of Job, and that is in Job chapter 40, verse 2, where God himself shows up and uses the name for himself, basically saying, I'm here, what are we going to talk about? Job 40, verse 2 says, will he who disputes with Shaddai be reproved? Who argues with God? Let him answer. And so he calls Job on the carpet to have their discussion. Book of Job's great stuff. I need to make more videos on it, but let's sum all this up. We've gone through all 48 references to Shaddai in the Hebrew Bible. That's it. That's all there is. And I tried to give enough context around it that you could see the context in which that name was being used. Some are more revealing than others, but I think that it's fair to say the most common theme throughout the entire Hebrew Bible with the name Shaddai is the theme of fertility, children, and families. There is, especially in the later books, the idea of destruction, but it always seems to be couched in terms of destruction by loss of children, and in the case of Isaiah, destruction through childbirth. There is also some association with land inheritance and home stability that seems to be associated with the name. Now, oddly, there are 4 times where the name is associated with a name change, one of them being the introduction of a new name for God himself. The vast majority of the time the name Shaddai is used, it is by non-Israelites. The name seems to be associated with protection and is particularly associated with wings, which is used 4 times associated with wings. And wings, of course, were often a symbol of protection from a mother bird type. And then there is one really good example of Shaddai being associated with a god of the mountain. That's what we know about it. What do you think the name Shaddai means? If I were pressed to find a way to represent it in English, I would probably translate it as God of families. Anyway, that's it. Until next time, Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.